Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Robin Lewis. I'm a naturopathic physician practicing here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And today I want to talk to you about stress. Now, we all know that stress isn't good for us, but we might not fully understand why or what we can do about it. Because really, stress is inevitable. We can't really control what's going to stress us out in a day, but we can arm ourselves with the tools to make sure that that stress doesn't have negative health consequences. Because I'm sure all of you can relate to going through a period, if not periods, of stress where the stress is so severe that you're starting to feel the impacts on your physical body and on your mental health. So today I'm going to talk about how stress, but more specifically how cortisol, the hormone released when we are stressed, is impacting our overall health. But before I get into how stress is impacting us, I need to define for you what is cortisol and what is it doing in the body. Because really, a lot of the times when we're trying to help mitigate the damaging effects of stress, we're targeting cortisol. So let's dive into what is cortisol. Cortisol is often referred to as our stress hormone, and it is released when we are experiencing stress. It is responsible for the majority of the health consequences that we see as a consequence of severe and chronic stress as well. So it is the reason that you can't sleep when you're highly stressed. It's the reason why you tend to gain weight, especially around the midsection when you're stressed for long periods of time. It's also the reason why our immune system function doesn't work very well, and therefore you might get sick more often. So cortisol is a hormone that is very, very important inside of the body. And it is actually made from cholesterol, which most of us understand in the context of heart disease. And this cholesterol is converted into our stress hormone inside of our adrenal glands. Now, adrenal glands are these teeny tiny little glands that live on top of your kidneys, and they are responsible for secreting that cortisol. So they make it and they secrete it, along with a couple other things like adrenaline and some of the hormones needed to regulate fluid inside the body. So whether or not you're retaining water. Now, like anything, you don't want too much cortisol and you also don't want too little. And as I will go on later to talk about, we also care about how that cortisol is getting released throughout the day. And if we look at the effects of stress on cortisol, it does tend to follow a similar pattern as the stress becomes more chronic and more persistent. So when we're first dealing with high amounts of stress, our cortisol will actually go up. And that is because your body is responding to all of the different things that you're exposed to that are stressful throughout the day. And it doesn't really matter what kind of stress that is either. So it doesn't matter if it's because you're dealing with a deadline at work, dealing with a move or a renovation, or even just watching the news in the evening, which tends to have a more negative connotation. Either way, your body is releasing cortisol every time it has to deal with that. And of course, the more things that you're exposed to and the higher the stress, the more cortisol that is released, at least initially. And this is when you'll start to exhibit signs of high cortisol. Now, eventually, your body gets burnt out from producing this much cortisol on a daily basis. So, if the stress is chronic and persistent for long enough, we will reach what's considered adrenal burnout. It's actually called a lot of different things. A lot of people don't really like that term nowadays, but either way, the theme is similar to when you're dealing with something like type 2 diabetes, which is essentially that you keep eating too much sugar, your body has to release insulin every time you eat that sugar, and the body gets tired of producing that insulin over time, and then you start to become type 2 diabetic. Now, this cortisol picture can be similar in the regards that you've just abused this system for too long. You are relentlessly exposing yourself to little and big stressors throughout the day. You're not great at managing these stressors, perhaps, and it's starting to build up, and your body is getting tired of producing this much cortisol. And when your body has to respond to that much cortisol relentlessly, you will also begin to become tissue resistant. So your body won't respond to the cortisol the same way. And in either of these situations, you have an issue because in the first situation, your cortisol is high. So you are exhibiting signs of high cortisol. And then eventually, as your tissues stop responding, or perhaps that your adrenal glands can't keep up anymore, you get signs of low cortisol. And as I mentioned earlier, you want a nice middle range and you want it to peak at certain times of the day and not at others. Why do we care? Now let's dive into the many different roles of cortisol so that you can appreciate why this is so important to get under control. The first one, which is very, very common nowadays, is for blood sugar issues. So, cortisol, because it is associated with stress, it is associated with what's considered our fight or flight response. So, in our past history, when we were still hunter-gatherers, this system developed to alert us if there was, say, a predator in the area. And what our body does in response to that is it gets you ready for fight or flight. And so your blood sugars will go up because theoretically you need more sugar that can be available to your muscles so you can run away, or available to your brain so you can think quickly and sharply. Now, of course, when we are stressed nowadays, that isn't necessarily the case. We don't need to run away. We are stimulating our blood sugars for no reason, and then this can eventually lead to blood sugar issues in addition to cortisol issues. The other thing that cortisol plays a big role in is your weight. Now, of course, weight is very complex. There's lots of different things that influence whether or not you'll gain or lose weight, but cortisol definitely plays a role here. So, there is one key mechanism that they at least understand could be responsible for this, and that is because cortisol has a heavy influence on our thyroid. High cortisol levels have been shown to stop the activation of your thyroid hormone. Now, your thyroid is very well known for influencing your metabolism. So, if you have a poorly functioning thyroid or your thyroid hormone isn't active, your metabolism will be slow. So, you will therefore be more likely to gain weight and more resistant to weight loss. Now, this isn't the only thing that cortisol does in this whole weight equation, but this is a very big one. And also, for those of you who are trying to put on muscle, high cortisol is also not going to be your friend because it very much promotes protein breakdown. And what are your muscles made out of? Protein. This is a very loose, simplified explanation, but yes, cortisol very much plays a role in people who struggle with their weight. Another aspect of your health that is influenced by cortisol is your mental alertness, especially in the morning. So, this is part of what's considered our cortisol awakening response. And I will go into this a little bit better later. But essentially, first thing in the morning, you want a rise in your cortisol, and it helps you feel alert. Like I was saying before, it's part of this fight or flight response. So it helps you bring blood flow and nutrients to the brain so that you can think sharply. Now, this response should happen in the first 20 minutes of your day. So when you wake up, it should only take you about 20 minutes to feel like your brain has switched on for the day. If it takes closer to hours, which I see in a lot of my patients, that is a sign that this cortisol system isn't kicking in well enough. Your cortisol isn't getting going first thing in the morning. It's taking a long time to get there, and that's why your brain doesn't really want to switch on right away. And alternatively, if cortisol is too high at night, it will make you too alert to go to sleep. So this is a very interesting thing that I see in a lot of my patients who struggle with cortisol and stress regulating issues. Your brain cells actually have receptors for cortisol. So in addition to feeling more alert in the morning, it very much plays a role in memory, learning, motivation, a lot of our neural functioning is influenced by cortisol levels. So as you can imagine, if it's too much or too little, this is also going to have an impact on your cognition. How good are you at functioning throughout the day and pulling up specific memories? In fact, one of the biggest signs I see in a younger demographic who are struggling with this is they lose words more easily. They have a hard time remembering what they ate yesterday. Little things like this that are obviously not full on dementia or anything like that or learning disabilities, but just not as sharp as you used to be. This is very much a cortisol picture for a lot of people. Another big role of cortisol inside of the body is its role with inflammation. Now, this relationship is quite complicated because, in some regards, it promotes inflammation and will flare things like autoimmune disease or cardiovascular disease, which are very inflammatory in nature. And in other regards, it can be anti-inflammatory. And in fact, our glucocorticoid medications, which are used to manage a lot of these conditions, are very similar in nature to cortisol. So this molecule inside of the body has a big role in just regulating inflammation. You can't really say it's necessarily anti-inflammatory or pro-inflammatory, but if your cortisol is nice, healthy, and balanced, it will also help ensure that the inflammation inside of your body is balanced. And you can see this very obviously in medicine because you will see people with, say, an autoimmune condition flare when they're stressed. Stress doesn't really help a lot of these pain disorders, things like that. And so this is why too much or too little definitely does not help with inflammatory conditions. And this is very much related to your immune system as well, which is, again, very much influenced by cortisol. So, similar to inflammation, it works with your immune system a lot of the time. And in fact, inflammation and your immune system are pretty hard to separate because you need to build inflammation in order to mount a response to a cold or a flu or a bug or a virus or whatever you're trying to fight off. You need inflammation to do that. And so that's why cortisol, inflammation, your immune system, they're all very much intertwined. What I most often see when it comes to cortisol and its influence on the immune system is just by weakening it overall. Of course, in extreme cases where you're on these medications that look a lot like cortisol, they can fully suppress the immune system and put you at a very high risk. But if we're talking about someone's internal production of cortisol, so you're not taking a medication that looks like cortisol, then this is going to be just a general weakening of the immune system. So maybe you get sick more often or you don't recover very well. And in fact, that's probably how it presents the most is these colds or flus just get drug out over a long period of time. And that can be very much a part of this whole adrenal fatigue, high cortisol, low cortisol picture. If this system isn't working well, neither is your immune system. Another interesting thing that cortisol will do when it's imbalanced in the body is worsen pain. And I think a lot of us can relate to this. Stress certainly doesn't help my aches and pains, and in most people, it doesn't help. And this can be related to the inflammatory aspect of cortisol. So if it's playing around with inflammation can definitely influence your pain. But nonetheless, the relationship is there. And in either case, high or low, it does tend to worsen pain. And in fact, a very debilitating condition called fibromyalgia, which is essentially where people feel a lot of pain in a lot of places and they don't really have a good reason for why they have pain in those areas. So it's not really associated with an injury in the past or anything like that. They have often been found to have low cortisol. So, in a lot of these people, if they can really get their cortisol more balanced and their adrenals doing better, their pain improves. So, the pain cortisol relationship is super interesting. Now, another very interesting aspect of cortisol is its influence on the skin. So, generally speaking, there's two main influences that cortisol can have on the skin. First being its relation to acne. So cortisol has been shown to stimulate the oil production inside of your follicles. So in that regard, it can tend to have people break out, which I think a lot of us have experienced in our past. So depending on where you get your breakouts, it'll exacerbate that. And another thing is it can also make your skin more frail and thin. Now, you see this more often in more extreme cases of cortisol issues. So, this would be things like Cushing's disease. So, you're producing way too much cortisol. It's a pathological amount of cortisol. So, in these cases, they have very thin skin and very frail skin, and they'll get these really thick stretch marks because their skin is just not very strong. It doesn't have good elasticity. If we're talking about not that extreme of an example, you will just notice more aging of the skin. So yeah, it might thin a little bit, but maybe not as dramatically. But the wrinkles will be more defined. Your skin will just not have the same amount of repair that it would previously. Now, cortisol also just has an overall impact on aging. It has been shown to shorten telomere length. Now, I do not have time to go super in depth with this, but basically, the ends of our DNA, which are called telomeres, has been linked to longevity and aging. The theory is that the shorter those telomeres get, the more rapidly you're aging. And something that shortens those telomeres more rapidly is stress and cortisol and dysregulated cortisol. So, yes, it's going to wear more on the skin as far as the aging of your appearance goes, but also internally, you're just going to age more rapidly. So, as you can see, stress and cortisol have a huge role inside of the body. And I'm not even covering all of the things that it does inside of the body because that would be an extremely long episode. But just know that these are some of the key areas, and stress and cortisol have a heavy influence inside of the body. Now, depending on your unique genetic makeup, it might show up in various different ways. So it might not always show up with all of these things, but maybe some of these things, depending on the person and depending on where they are with that stress dysregulation, where you are with your cortisol, things like that. Now, if we were to talk about what I actually see in clinic, I'd say a very typical presentation when someone's in that early stage where their cortisol is really high, they tend to present with maybe a little bit more anxiety, insomnia. They might have blood sugar issues, changes to their weight, both up or down. And then as things progress, this is when the really heavy fatigue sets in, maybe even depression. You can still get anxiety, but it's more of a I can't find the effort to control this anymore type of anxiety rather than being more like of a stimulated type of anxiety. People will then start to notice that their memory or their cognition just isn't what it used to be. Then they start getting more sick more often or just being poor recovery from the gym. All of these different things tend to present on a bit of a spectrum. The full on burnout picture, where you can't really bring yourself to do anything, you can't think right, you can't feel right, nothing is going well, that is preventable. Even if you still have the same job and the same family and the same amount of stress in your life, figuring out how to deal with that stress, arming yourselves with the tools to deal with it is very paramount. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about what can happen if your cortisol is too high or too low. But what we also need to emphasize is the fact that cortisol, much like many of our hormones, works on a 24-hour clock. So, in a perfect world, your cortisol would be highest in the morning, as I've already mentioned when I was talking about mental alertness. In the first 20 minutes or so of your day, your cortisol should peak, allowing you to feel awake. And then throughout the day, we want it to slowly peter off, being lowest at night, allowing us to fall asleep. We don't want to be alert at night. And also, cortisol has a negative influence on melatonin, which is our sleepy hormone. It's what allows us to reach those deep stages of sleep. and it does not like cortisol. So if your cortisol is too high at night, it's going to make you have that monkey brain before bed. So maybe you're going over all the things you should have done, the things you wish you didn't say, whatever random thoughts pop up and impair us from falling asleep. That's very much a cortisol thing at night. And it's also going to worsen the quality of your sleep because you're not going to be able to fall into those deeper stages. So maybe you're a lighter sleeper. You wake up frequently and you have a hard time falling back asleep. This can be due to the timing of your cortisol. So maybe your cortisol is not generally super high if we were to average it throughout the day, but maybe it's just too high at night relative to what it should be. Now, another reason I really want you to understand this is because understanding this will help you understand why cortisol is not best measured as a snapshot in time. So if you go to the doctor and just have your cortisol measured during a blood draw and it's just 1 point throughout the day, that doesn't give you the context of cortisol. It doesn't really tell you where your cortisol is at night in relation to where it is during the morning versus the afternoon. You really want that beautiful 24-hour picture to fully understand what you can do about it. And this is really where saliva testing comes in, because this is a kit that is sent home with people and they take multiple samples throughout the day. So some earlier in the day, some later in the day, to really map out where that cortisol is throughout the day so that you can be more informed. Just overall high or low isn't as helpful as understanding where in the day is it too high, where in the day is it too low. And then the other aspect of saliva testing versus just a blood draw is that it's supposed to be a more accurate reflection of active cortisol. Much like a lot of our hormones, they can be free, therefore active, or bound up by binding proteins. And this is really more where we get into the more nuanced details of testing for hormones and understanding hormones. But basically, a bound up cortisol isn't doing anything in the body. A free active cortisol is. So saliva testing is supposed to give us the active cortisol, the cortisol that lives inside of our tissue and inside of our saliva glands. So it's not only telling us more information of how cortisol behaves throughout a day, but it's a more accurate reflection of the cortisol that is actually available to do things inside of the body, not the bound up cortisol that might not be super relevant for its impact in the body because it's not doing anything when it's bound up. And this is really where people can get confused because they think, oh, I've had it tested in my blood. I'm totally fine. Which little did they know that that's not actually the best way to test it. And maybe it had to do with just when you had it tested throughout the day. If it was in the middle of the day, maybe it wasn't too high or too low at that point. And so this is really important for people to understand because if you really want definitive answers, you're going to have to choose the right testing method. You want to strategize your treatment plan based on how high or low your cortisol is and at what time of the day. So now let me explain what I mean by that. So I'll often give therapies that are supposed to boost cortisol in the first half of the day. So this can be adaptogenic herbs that are maybe on the stimulating side. This can be things like exposing yourself to sunlight in the morning, which Andrew Huberman talks a lot about. His podcast and his YouTube channel is phenomenal. And he talks a lot about exposing your eyes to sunlight to stimulate that cortisol production in the morning. Cold showers can also do it. B vitamins help nourish this whole adrenal pathway, and they can also be a little bit more of a stimulating thing to have during the day. Either way, you gear more of your treatments to increasing cortisol during the day. So even if you're bottomed out low cortisol, you still shouldn't take a lot of these therapies at night because you don't want it high at night. Maybe that's not your problem. It's the fact that you don't perk it up during the day. And the same can go the other way. When we're talking about cortisol lowering at night, because perhaps it's too high, we're talking about things like decreasing our exposure to blue light before bed, because the blue light that's emitted from our devices, such as the one you're watching me on right now, so phones and MacBooks and Windows, all these different computers, they're emitting blue light that is stimulating this cortisol when we don't want it to at night. And we might give things like ashwagandha or other herbs that are known to lower cortisol at night. We might avoid doing stressful things before bed, like reading the news, checking emails. Now, we're going to go over all of this in a future episode. So, this is really just to set the stage of like, what does the system mean? How is it impacting me? How do I investigate this? And how do I start to think about cortisol? What are the general principles that I can follow when I'm engaging in therapy with doctors? I really hope that you guys found today's episode helpful. Please comment below if you have any other things that you'd like me to deep dive on, or if any questions came up from today. And thank you again for listening, and we will talk again soon.